Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Darian the Eclectic, and today we're continuing our story grid writing series. So if you're not familiar with story grid, it is a writing and editing methodology that incorporates a lot of different elements. And I will be doing an overview video on all the different things that are included with the story grid writing method. But this series in particular is talking about the different genre conventions and obligatory scenes for each genre that the story grid writing methodology covers. And the reason this is important is it really helps you create a satisfying story for the reader with the things that they expect to see in those particular genres. If you're writing a horror story, for example, which is what we're covering today, but you leave out certain obligatory scenes or genre conventions, the reader is going to finish the book, or maybe not finish the book, feeling unsatisfied because you didn't check all those boxes. So let's get into the horror genre conventions and obligatory scenes. So the first genre convention for the horror genre is a monster or an evil force. If it's horror, you've got to have the horrifying thing. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Make sure if you're writing horror, you've got that monster that's going to do horrible things, or you've got that evil force, whether that's paranormal or demonic or whatever it is. There's something there that is causing the horrifying things to occur. Number two in genre conventions for horror is isolation of the characters. They cannot be allowed to get help easily. So we're playing on a lot of psychology when we write horror. And one of those psychological fears for a lot of people is isolation, is being alone and not being able to help. So this can mean isolating your characters far out in the wilderness where they can't get help. And it can also mean separating a group so that they're all alone. Each individual is by themselves and they cannot help each other. It is really, really important to make sure each character has to deal with these things on their own, because it makes it that much scarier. It makes it that much more interesting for the reader to see how each character is going to react and who's going to die, who's going to get possessed by the demon, whatever it might be. Isolation is key. Number three in the horror genre convention is characters ignoring warnings and signs. So this is the classic, I hear a noise down in the scary basement and I have to go and investigate. What people would most likely do in that situation, or the safer option, would be to pick up the phone and call 911, or to leave the house until it's daylight outside and it's safer to investigate. But no, the character needs to do the thing that they're not supposed to do, right? Or there are a lot of classics here. My favorite horror series are the classic 90s Scream type slasher films, and the characters are making the wrong decisions all the time. They see all the signs that their boyfriend is a bad guy, and yet they still love them and they still want to be with them. But they're ignoring the signs that they're a serial killer. And what happens next? They get murdered by the serial killer, or they watch all their friends murdered by the serial killer, right? So make sure your characters are ignoring those warnings and signs, because it gives the reader or the viewer something to be like, no, that's not right. Don't do that. And they know something is coming, right? It amps up the tension and anticipation of the horrific thing about to happen. So make sure your characters are ignoring the warnings and the signs. Which leads us to the fourth genre convention, and that's rising dread and suspense. So every time the characters make the wrong decision, ignore warnings and signs, go into that dark basement, it's increasing that tension. It's increasing the dread and the suspense that comes with the reader, the viewer, knowing something bad is about to happen. And if we can draw it out and continue to, give them those jump scares that aren't real, like the cat jumping out the window or into the window and startling the protagonist or the character, so that you think something bad is about to happen, but really it's just a jump scare. That's a way you can increase that dread and that suspense until finally they're up against that monster or that evil force. And number four in the horror genre convention is the theme of morality. So a lot of times, what you'll see in horror stories is that there is a really unlikable flaw with one of the characters, maybe even the protagonist. And that's kind of a signal that that character is going to die. So they're going to get their comeuppance, right? If they're a bad person, they're going to be someone who's going to die. And maybe even this is how your story starts out, showing this monster or evil force is you see a really bad guy doing something bad, and then they get their comeuppance by the monster, by the evil force, which introduces us to the story. And then you've got some good people who may or may not live, may or may not do the right thing because they're making, they're ignoring warnings and signs and making bad decisions. But it sets it up for us. And it shows that, morality plays a role in these stories, and not always in the most obvious way, but it can show you a little insight into that. So again, horror is a lot about psychology and the moral decision-making processes that the characters are going to go throughout the story. Maybe they even overcome those flaws and they start out as not a great person, but they end up surviving at the end because they turned around at some point and they made those right decisions. And maybe they were the good person all along, and then they're the only one to survive. So there's a lot of different examples out there if you go and look at the different types of horror movies, types of horror stories out there, and you can see how the moral theme kind of plays a role throughout all of them. All right, so now let's talk about the obligatory scenes within the horror genre. And number one is something you might have seen a lot in the story grid writing video series, and that is the inciting threat. So again, if we start off the story showing a really bad guy who gets his comeuppance by the monster or the evil force, then that's right away showing us the inciting threat. There is a monster, an evil force out there, and it is coming for them. Right away, the reader knows exactly what kind of story this is, and you've checked that box in the genre conventions and the obligatory scenes by showing them this is a horror story and what kind of horror story it is. Number two in the obligatory scenes is the protagonist confronting the evil force. So obviously we don't have a story if the protagonist and the threat don't actually come together. So at some point the protagonist is put in the position that they are now involved with this monster, with this evil threat, this evil force, and they have a confrontation. So this is the group of people who go camping, and slowly one by one they're being picked off, and finally the protagonist, the hero, the most likable character maybe, is put up against that monster, that evil force that has been picking them all off one by one. Number three in the obligatory scenes is most likely going to be a lot of different scenes, and that is them trying to escape and survive this evil force, this threat, this monster. So this is kind of our trifail cycles. Once again, this is the meat of the horror story, is the protagonist having to try to survive, try to escape this evil force, and maybe even try to help their friends, or confronting, seeing other people destroyed by this evil force, right? This is the big part of the story. This is the pitch of what exactly is going to happen. Number four in obligatory scenes for the horror genre is all hope seems lost. So there has to be a point where the hero of the story, the protagonist, has maybe lost all their friends, they're the only one left, or they're one of the only characters left, and they are backed up into a corner. They feel like this is it, they're going to die. The evil monster, force, threat, whatever, is about to get them. It is right there, and they're barely surviving in this moment, and it's about to end. And they know it. They know they're about to die. And finally, number five in the horror genre obligatory scenes is the confrontation with the evil force. So this is the showdown between the protagonist and the monster, or the protagonist and the evil threat, evil force. So this is where we see our hero pull through somehow, some way. They dig deep, they fight tooth and nail. We think that there is just as much a chance, if not more, that they are not going to make it out of this. And they fight tooth and nail. And somehow, some way, they pull something out that defeats the monster, defeats this evil force, or at least puts it away for a little while, right? Subdues it for the next 27 years, let's say. But one thing about this is it cannot come out of nowhere. The way that they defeat this monster, this evil force, has to be the Chekhov's gun. And Chekhov's gun is a principle in storytelling where, for example, you see the gun on the mantle at the beginning of the story, and at the end of the story, you shoot the gun, right? So that's the principle. There's a lot of things that go with that, but basically it's you have to put the solution somewhere visible. You have to plant the seed of the solution for it to be plausible, so that by the time the hero or the protagonist actually uses that to save the day, to survive, to win, that it doesn't come out of nowhere, that it feels inevitable and still surprising for the reader at the end. So those are the obligatory scenes and the genre conventions for horror. If you're a horror writer, or if you have more thoughts on what goes into writing a great horror story, please comment down below. Let's keep the conversation going. Otherwise, we're going to continue this series with another video next, and I will see you there. Thanks for watching. Bye.